do you find the houses? I mean, is there something like once a week in the legal notices in the newspaper, or is that the way, or what are the methods to find what's in foreclosure and target houses?
So a couple ways. One, of course, is you can get subscriptions to Realty Track. And then with Realty Track, every time there's a filing, every time there's a foreclosure that's finished, et cetera, you can get it. You can go to the website like every week or every month or whatever and get a report on all the foreclosures that happened from this date to that date. But the best way that we found, we did it in Miami and some others, is to, in several other cities where we did the work, is to identify a specific neighborhood in which you're going to do the work. Get a map, draw and say, okay, this neighborhood is going to be from this barrier to that barrier to this barrier to that barrier. And then you drive every single street, every single avenue slowly, and you look for signs on both sides of the street that a house might be vacant or abandoned. And then if it looks like it is, you pull over, you take down the address, you get that out of the car, you look around the house. You don't enter it the first time, but you look around the house, you try to assess if it's vacant or not. And that is the scouting team. So the scouting team scouts it out, looks at it. The scouting team then takes this list of all the vacant homes, hands them off to the research team. The research team then looks online at public records, which you guys do have here. You put in the address, and you find out from the address who owns the house. And then you have to both look up the address, and you have to look up court records to see, because it still could be owned by an individual, but you look up the court records to see if it's in the middle of a foreclosure process, and if so, where it is in the foreclosure process. And then you piece together a story about where the house was, and so. And you would go back and visit the house again. This time, maybe try to gain entry into it, or the time just look at it, see if anything moved. If you go back the second time and the lawn is cut, then you know someone's watching it. Or if you go back to and it just looks in the exact same condition, then you know someone's not watching it. And then you make decisions about it. At some point you have to gain entry, and that's a whole other thing. But it's either going to be by having access to one of these electronic things that aggregate the foreclosures, or it's going to be by driving street by street, avenue by avenue, getting the list of places that are vacant, and then finding out whether or not they're foreclosed. But there's no shortcut to it at all. Even when you get the list, you're still going to have to go and drive through. There's no shortcut to that at all.
What you've laid out is a very good model, and I understand the whole problem of trying to take on too many other issues and build a broader movement beyond what you've laid out here. But I am curious, though, if you've given thought to, or down the road, that the concept of a community land trust would be broadened out to include not just houses, putting people in houses or keeping them in houses, but community land trust being used to create the building blocks of a cooperative community survival economy, you know, like growing food, setting up workshops, people can make things, and that sort of thing. So that's one question I have. The second is outreach education. I mean, a lot of people realize there's something profoundly wrong with our economy, right? They don't always and they understand the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. They don't necessarily understand the structure and dynamics of the capitalist system. So, and another aspect of that is the history, principles, and methods of direct action. Do you see partnering with other groups or movements to not only educate about what's wrong with the economy, but, you know, to educate and train people in terms of doing direct action, not only just defending against evictions, taking homes and defending against evictions, but other kinds of direct actions that confront, you know, corporate power directly. And the last thing is, these banks often bank the money that local governments operate with, as well as they handle the investment funds of a lot of local and state governments. And it would seem to me that the public policy people, once they're up and running, or you know, the people who know how to do the research, could figure out not only which banks are, you know, the worst offenders in terms of foreclosures and evictions, but whether or not some of these same banks hold our public money
So in terms of the community land trust being broadened out, you know, you mentioned briefly that the community land trust would be able to have control large swaths of land, and just the community would be able to decide, do we need housing here, do we need farmland here, do we need whatever. We say all the time that Take Back Land, and we saw it back in the video that M said, Take Back Land is not a housing organization, it's a land organization. And the extent to which we need land for recreation, and for farming, and for business, and we need to have land use available for that, depending on what the community wants and what the community needs and what the community ultimately desires. So yes, we do see that, and Anna always reminds us, you know, that we so we have these ideas of community control over land, and we're trying to develop some mechanisms or create some institutions that would help accomplish that. But the point is not the institutions. In fact, there are community land trusts right now. And there are community land trusts that are doing terrible jobs. And there are community land trusts that are doing great, you know, good jobs in terms of what they're doing, but they're not changing people's lives. They're not transforming society. So the transforming society part happens at the organizing level, not at the land trust level. But we need land trusts, or we need some kind of mechanism to which we can have the community have direct control, to which the community can exercise direct control over land. But the purpose is not to have a land trust. The purpose is to have community control and to really transform communities. And that happens at organizing. That does not happen at the land trust level, the institutional level. I think the same answer is probably appropriate for the second question, which was around the political education. So we do political education and workshops and trainings on what direct action and positive action are. We have several workshops. We've done it for a number of organizations. This is only one of them. We have probably 10 or so that we do in one shape, form, or another, and are trying to build out more. So we do that, and other organizations do that, but that's where the real transformation happens, is with political education, leadership development. And the reality is, when we're saying to people that we want to have community control over land as opposed to individual ownership of land, we are really challenging ideas that are long held, and that's not going to happen by making one presentation. We're going to have to go through consistent bouts of leadership development and political education, and in order to win people's hearts and minds. And then finally, in terms of the banks and the relationships with local governments, I do think that there's some value in terms of recognizing the supply chain and where weak points could be, or pressure points could be. It's extremely important to find those things out in order to get them. However, I do think we could potentially waste a whole lot of time trying to figure those nuances out and then get caught in the nuance without missing the big picture, which is, you know, whether you know the specific ways in which the relationships happen. Most people know that the government is doing the bidding of the banks because the banks are bribing government officials. And I don't need to know, you know, that the cousin of the elected official got hired by the bank in order to figure that out. I mean, sometimes that helps, because but even if you get that person fired, they're just going to be replaced by someone else, a relative of another sort. So the big thing is that we have to make those institutions irrelevant, not by pretending that they're not there, not fighting against the injustice they produce. We have to do that, but by creating these alternative institutions where we can, that'll include banks, that'll include elected officials. Although it should be noted that there are several cities which have done some level of divestment because of public pressure and put the money into these community banks, not community, what are they called? Credit unions. Only for activists to find out credit unions engage in the exact same behavior as the banks did. They just did it on a local scale instead of on a national scale. So that doesn't, the real problem is not Citibank or Bank of America or any of these other, it's the system that gives rise to Citibank and Bank of America.
How many cities is Take Back Land in, and where's the headquarters?
So we don't really have a headquarters because it's kind of like a decentralized, but we have a leadership team. I'm in DC, Em is here, and Rob Robinson is in New York City. We have, you can probably think of it as like concentric circles, you know, smaller circle, bigger circle, bigger circle. We have a small circle of probably about 10 to 12 cities with organizations with whom we work very, very closely. We have a real close relationship with, speak to regularly, and we work with regularly on their actions. And then you have a little bit of a bigger circle with organizations that we work with pretty regularly, but we probably don't have the same level of political unity as the ones with which we have in the smaller circle, for a number of reasons. I think the primary one is even though those other organizations may say that they are for housing as a human right, they haven't made any steps that would look like they're going towards that. They're still going to principal reduction, and they haven't been able to move that next step up. And then the third step out are just organizations that are doing this work and recognize that Take Back the Land has been doing this work for a long time and contact us once in a while when they need advice.
There was the whole Occupy movement in Madison, turning into more of like a tent city and homeless shelter. How do you see the intersection between their demands to have public space with, I heard you say in the presentation, everyone should be able to live inside. And so how do we work on all these different fronts? Or do you see yourself just focusing on one front and other people will do, parallel?
Well, I think we can have that and we are going to have that. The reality is organizations are built to address whatever issues they're built to address, and there are people who are interested in one issue over the next. We're not going to go and try to convince people who are in the animal rights movement to dump that and move into land or housing rights, and vice versa. We don't expect to do the same. But there probably are things that we can find in common, and we need to figure out then how do we move down the road in common for as long as we possibly can. I think one of the things that we have to do is we have to be able to sit in a room with those other forces who we think of as being on the same side and be able to have clear and open discussions, I think, about two things. One is about what we have in common, and that would be what do we see in common, what are the objectives that we have, what are the common targets that we have, things like that. And the other is we need to have really, really frank and open conversations about what we don't have in common. That's going to include both objectives, and then when that happens, we should challenge each other on that. Like, we are on calls regularly with other organizations engaged in eviction defense work, and we're challenging them. We're saying, you're not doing enough by doing principal reduction. You should be doing more than that, and you know you should be doing more than that. We have to debate with them and discussion with them. And sometimes we think we convince them, sometimes we don't think we convince them. We have an obligation to challenge. And then we also have to challenge other organizations and each other on things like race, class, gender, homophobia, things like that. And I think it has to be an ongoing discussion. It has to happen open and clearly in order for us to move on. As it relates to Occupy, I think Occupy is extremely exciting, has done some amazing things, and probably will continue to do some amazing things. I do think that there are some issues with the way that Occupy is set up, which will keep it from being able to reach some of the next levels. And I think that's why those are the grounds in which we need to challenge Occupy. I mentioned this earlier, but I think one of the things Occupy has to figure out in terms of some of the spaces that it's taking, and this is true in most cities, is it has to decide, are the spaces it's taking, is that housing space or is that political space? And this was caused mass confusion with the outdoor takeovers, where it seemed like initially Occupy invited street homeless people into the encampment as one of the ways of building up its numbers. And people say, okay, as soon as we get 500 people here, they won't be able to evict us out. We've only got 200, let's invite some homeless people in here, and then that'll increase the numbers and they'll be here all the time. And I think that was problematic on a number of levels. And what happened, there was a lack of clarity between whether this was political space or whether this was housing. And that lack of clarity created all kinds of tension between the two groups. So you had people who thought that this was political space, who were there in political space, and they were resentful about the fact that homeless people were in this political space and not engaged in political activity. You're like, why aren't you engaged in political activity? And then you had homeless individuals who thought this was housing, and they're like, why are you in my living room talking about political activity? And why don't you just let me have dinner and let me have some peace and quiet instead of talking about this political stuff. I think the lack of clarity about those things caused tensions which could have been avoided, and should we decide, is this political space? And if it is, then it should not be used as housing for people who need housing, and it should be hardcore political space in whichever way. But if it's used as housing, then it should be respected as housing space, and you can't have hardcore political actions a few blocks away and then run back into someone's house to hide, because you're putting that person in danger also. You decide what these things are and what they're not. And I think that lack of clarity then carried itself into Occupy when Occupy started doing vacant homes. And you had many cities, again, I don't know if Madison was one of them, but where you had Occupy would move 20 white kids into houses, empty houses in black neighborhoods, saying that they are providing housing, when none of the 20 kids were homeless. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. There was no family living there, and just caused a lot of resentment because those kids had no real relationship to the housing. And then they conflated, intentionally, unintentionally, I'm sure, they conflated housing issues with political issues, when they could have just taken the place over and said, look, this is going to be a political space, not a housing space, and not mix up the issues. I think we've got to develop clarity around what we're fighting for and how we're doing some of that fight.
And if I could add a few points, I think in terms of how people are being perceived as fighting on different fronts, I think a lot of that has to do with what's the current political space allowing people to publicly fight about, right? Because people have been organizing around housing since as long as I can remember, and even longer, right? So it's not that this is at all a new battle. It's maybe impacting different communities now, which allows it to be part of the political conversation happening on mainstream news and mainstream spaces, and so on and so forth. And I think, so something that I think about when I think about other movements, right? Because we think about Take Back the Land as a movement around a root cause, right? So we think that land is deeply linked to housing, deeply linked to food justices, immigration, policing the run of it, right? We think that land is at the root of a lot, and land control is at the root of a lot of it. But when a lot of other things pop up, I don't necessarily think they pop up with the root cause framework. And I think Occupy is an example of that. To my understanding of how Occupy happened, I think we were very similar tactically in that we were taking space back, taking back things, but I think at first the objectives were very different. I think Occupy set out to be mainly around bank accountability, right? And our work is partly about bank accountability, but it's also about culture, it's also about government, it's also about, it's a lot of other things attached to that. And so in terms of how do we work together, I guess what Occupy has to answer now, and I think they're starting to and have been, is how do they move beyond being a single issue movement, being a single issue organizing agent, right? It's like, how do they move from thinking about public spaces being available for protest, but also being a way to house people and so on and so forth. Because I could bet my bottom dollar that if I went to Occupy in Madison and I went around and asked everybody who was there, what are they here for, they would all say very different things. Homeless people would say, no, I would rather live in a house if I could live in a house. But is there political space now in the current agenda? Are people just as energized about taking back homes and decommodifying land as they are about bank accountability, right? So I think those are a couple other things in addition to what Matt said.
I think around tying movements together, it's really interesting because, and we've talked about this, but even just working with the Black community in Madison, how do you get Southeast Asians who've lost most of their homes due to foreclosures to be interested in Occupy, or to be interested in Take Back the Land in the way that we were seeing it. And the thing was that housing is an issue for us, but because of our culture, because of how recent we came to this country and how we're still connected to our way of living, is that when you lose your home, you move in with me. So we don't have a lot of folks who are on the street homeless. We have a lot of folks who are on paper homeless. But as long as we have family, you'll have a roof over your head. So you have 10, 15 people living in 3 or 2 bedroom apartments or homes. And so to us, it was well, that's not in our community, that's not priority for us, right? What was priority was that we were so far removed from land that when we lost our homes, being of Asian culture, we automatically assumed it was our fault. We couldn't keep the job, or we lost the job. It wasn't necessarily the company's fault because they had let us go anyway. So there was a lot of internal blaming. And so of course we couldn't get the Southeast Asian folks to show up to Occupy or to liberate a home, because they moved out before the bank told them to move out. You know what I mean? Because they felt it was their own failure. And then also being refugees, there's this fear of authority, and so as soon as you get that letter, you move. So I guess to bring it back and to tie it into Take Back the Land for housing as a human right, like I think for us as even folks who work with a lot of self-assessments, like how do we tie that to our community so that they know that their liberation is also tied to housing, right? And that 15 people don't have to live in a 2-bedroom apartment. And it's because of affordable housing. But we can't have that conversation until we have conversations about food, about gardens, about things that they're like really close to. And so what resonates with our Southeast Asian folks is very different from what resonates with our Black communities, right? And that like taking back a little piece of Brittingham Park for a garden is like what they want. But our folks are so in a different mindset that they will say, we will not garden in conflict land. So if there's an argument about this land, about us gardening here, we won't grow our food here. But like for folks to look at that as like, oh, well, they don't really want the garden there anyway. But it isn't. It's just, so there's so many different like cultural pieces, and I do agree that we could have very well joined the Occupy Madison, because there's a lot of folks in this community of colors who are homeless, but they didn't see that as one of their fights. Like living in a vacant parking lot is not somewhere where they envisioned that they would go, you know? So I think that our movements are kind of disjointed, and we need to figure out how to tie it all together, that in fact it is about one fight, and that in fact it is about affordable housing, and it is about poverty, and it is about race, and it is about class, and it is about gender, right? But how do we have that conversation in Madison so that all of those things matter and all of those things take precedence, right?
I guess I want to respond to that a little bit, because I've been really working on this front. So I'm with the Economic Democracy Conference, so the whole idea is how do we find economic empowerment back to the people? But I've worked with Occupy in New York, and even just knowing from different grassroots efforts, the biggest struggle I feel like, which is similar to what you guys are talking about, is the dialogue. And I think that's just, even with me doing outreach to how do I get, what about this conference would be interesting to people to know that, okay, this is actually for us. It's the facilitation and collaboration. How do we link these grassroots efforts to these policy changes, the direct actions to the support services? And I think it's really kind of what we're doing here, but it's really finding out, okay, what is this overall demand that we're looking for? And a lot of it is, I agree with like finding more local. We need more like local accountability, and we should have like, you know, communities should have a lot more say over certain things. But I mean, I think if there's one thing that I'm learning is from my experiences, it's that dialogue. We have to kind of really see what are the intentions, what is people's interests, and what is going to pull people towards things, and then how do we kind of find those common ground in dialogue, and move from there.
Yeah, that and I'm saying this purely from a context of having done work in Madison, so I'm not necessarily rebuttaling what you said, but I think also it's about, the truth is a lot of people have conflicting agendas, right? Like the hard truth of the matter is we are in a place that calls itself progressive, and they want to fight me because I said let's have some garden space in a park. Like that, you know what I mean? So I think like part of it is, right, like, is the hard truth that a lot of people who are perceived as allies are not allies, right? And I think us as movement folks have to be honest about that, right? So like part of it is that there's this conflicting agenda, right? And so it's like how are we prepared to move through that, right? And I think that may be one of your points, like how are people ready to engage in direct action, right? So once you've tried this, and this, once you've been in so many meetings, once you've had so many conversations, how are people willing to engage in direct action? A lot of people who are progressive don't support direct action, right? So I think there are like ideologically and fundamentally there are differences, you know what I mean? And I don't know that because like when I look at the movement model, part of like the significance of accountability within that movement model is that number 2, public policy is accountable to number 3 for third way, because the policy that you implement and develop should be furthering the world towards the third way, right? So like, and I think, and so I just think that the other hard truth is that a lot of people who are perceived as allies just are not allies, and so we have to be prepared to move past hoping that people show up. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that's the truth of what it means to be in a progressive Madison, is that, for me.
I fear that the fractured way in which we do our work as different entities in Madison contributes to the sense that our agendas are conflicting. We schedule events at the same time, we don't know who's doing what that we might support. And I wonder how we move from this, this place of silos to kind of a both and. So if this community's issues isn't gardens, how do we nevertheless turn out to support gardens? Because we've put together an agenda that's mutually encompassing. And again, I'm kind of drawing on grassroots postmodernism and the idea that the community gets to define, and each sub-community gets to define for itself what's important, So I don't come and tell other people what's important to them or try to convince anybody to do my agenda, but we line them up and look for those places, as you said, Max, where there's agreement, and then we move forward from those spaces, even if we don't have, across the board. We don't all want the same thing. I don't think it's necessary for us all to want the same thing if we agree with the principles.
It seems obvious but unstated that Take Back the Land has a land ethic that is anti-capitalist, but you're not calling that. It's anti-capitalist because it's not about commodities, it's not about profit making, it's not about certain kind of relationships. Yet, if you're going to be in that mode, I think you at least have to think about private property, because like when you were saying not everyone's your ally, because I remember when you did that second occupation, that was so powerful. And all of a sudden, all these well, it's illegal because it's private property. It doesn't belong to those people, and that suddenly put this veil down on people. And they never said, "Do you really have a right to own land?" I mean, I think that's a fundamental question. Do we really, as humans on this earth, have a right to say, "This is my property and not yours"? I really don't think so. But that's a big. I think that's sort of the underpinning of your ethic that maybe we just should be conscious of.